Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian. I am here today at the Rock Island Auction Company taking a look at some of the guns that they're going to be selling in their upcoming April of 2016 premiere auction. And earlier we took a look at a Japanese Pedersen style rifle that went through semi-auto testing before World War II. Today we're going to take a look at a second one. This looks much more like the traditional Vickers Pedersen style of rifle. It's got what I think is a very elegant line to it, very sleek. I think this is a fantastic looking rifle. Unfortunately for the fellows who designed and supported it, it wasn't as good as the one we previously looked at, which was, however, substantially less pretty. So this particular rifle is pretty much a totally faithful copy of John Pedersen's self-loading rifle design. And what I mean by that is it's still a delayed blowback action. So there's no gas system, the barrel doesn't move, there's nothing going on up here under the stock. This is just delayed blowback. So it's a toggle locked action. Most people are going to be familiar with that in the context of a Luger pistol. And what happens here is this acts kind of like a knee joint, where you've got two pieces like this, and when they bend, the bolt cycles. And the way that this is constructed, it's closely toleranced and done very precisely such that when the pressure from the chamber pushes backwards, most of that pressure is absorbed by the system, and just a little bit of it is directed to push the toggle up and out of battery, like so. The result is this delays the mechanics, the geometry here, delays the opening of the bolt until pressure has dropped in the chamber to a safe level. Now, as with many delayed blowback systems that use high pressure rifle cartridges, while this is safe and functional, it's kind of on the high pressure end of that. So while it does work, it is extracting cartridges while still under very high pressure. And what Pedersen discovered when he was testing this rifle in the US and the UK was that he actually had to put a hard wax coating on his ammunition in order to get it to work reliably. Now, after Pedersen demonstrated this rifle to the Americans and the British, and this was 1930 to 1932, that time frame, it looked like the Americans and the British were probably, well, certainly the Americans and maybe also the British were going to adopt this rifle. Really, at the time, you probably would have bet on Pedersen winning out this competition. He looked really good. So he took the rifle to some other places to demonstrate it, and one of those was Japan. And the Japanese military was also very impressed with this rifle. Not just because it looked like it was going to be adopted by some other powers, but they really liked the simplicity of the delayed blowback idea. That you didn't have to have gas ports and recoil systems and pistons, and you didn't need any of that. You just have a delayed action back here. So in 1931, the Japanese Army Ordnance Department had started some tests on self-loading rifles. They initially contacted General Kijiro Nambu, who was running his own firearms company. He, of course, had been responsible for their Type 11 light machine gun and a whole line of automatic pistols, really a talented firearms designer. And they asked him to develop both a light machine gun to replace the Type 11 and also to develop a self-loading rifle for them. And they gave him a whopping 3 months to do it. Now, what's impressive is he actually pulled that off. He developed a detachable mag, 10-round capacity, gas-operated rotating bolt rifle in that time frame. And he spent a year tweaking it and revising it and going through testing and then revising it some more and then testing more. And ultimately, by 1933, he bailed on the whole plan. He realized that his rifle wasn't ever going to meet the Army requirements, and he didn't think they were probably going to adopt a rifle at all anyway. So he dropped the rifle project to focus on light machine gun work, which turned out to be a really good, a prescient idea on his part. At that point, the Japanese had invited two other private companies into the testing, Nippon Special Steel and the Tokyo Gas and Electric Company. So they were both competing in 1933. And at the end of that testing, the Japanese Army Ordnance Department itself decided that it also wanted to compete in this trial. It thought it could do a good job, and this led to kind of a really awkward situation where An Army general was running the rifle development program, which was responsible for this rifle, and an Army colonel was running the rifle evaluation program. So that colonel is going to be in a really awkward position if the general, his superior's rifle, isn't the best one. How does a Japanese Army colonel tell a Japanese Army general that he's done something wrong? That's a tricky position, and it doesn't bode well for the commercial companies involved in the project that had to compete against the Army. Now, at any rate, the Army had decided it was just going to make a copy of Pedersen's rifle with a few Japanese touches to it, like the bayonet lug, the butt plate, a number of elements on this that are Japanese in style. And they stuck with the delayed blowback system, where interestingly, the Nippon Special Steel company had also decided to do a Pedersen-based rifle, but they made it gas-operated. Now, the Japanese had apparently Pedersen never actually told them about the wax coating he used on his cartridges. And having handled and fired some of that ammo, I can tell you, you don't necessarily recognize that it's a lubricated cartridge. You'd think that'd be pretty obvious, but in actuality, those cartridges, they have the feel kind of like a wax-coated Dixie paper cup. And if you didn't know the difference and didn't know something was special about them, you might very well not realize that anything was up. And apparently the Japanese didn't. Maybe Pedersen was saving that little tidbit of information in case they decided to just try and copy his rifle instead of actually licensing it from him. If that's the case, it worked, because the Japanese Army Ordnance Department always had problems with this rifle. After about 100 rounds of sustained fire, it would start to have ejection problems. And that's because it was heating up, and then the pressure was too high, cases were sticking and failing to extract properly, which would have been avoided if they'd used lubricated ammunition. So the Army Ordnance Department put a Japanese designer by the name of Hayahiko Mihara in charge of the development program for this rifle. He was working out of the Koishikawa Arsenal, located in Tokyo, and started work in 1933. The next set of trials was in 1935, and by that point, he had basically this gun. I don't know if this is an example from the first set of trials or the second. I don't have enough documentation to make the distinction there, but there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the two sets. The Ordnance Department submitted 12 rifles and 12 carbines, this is a rifle length example, to the 1935 testing, and they actually did pretty well. Had some issues, their accuracy wasn't as good as it could have been, and the reliability wasn't perfect. It was pretty good. As long as you weren't doing a lot of continuous sustained fire, it worked pretty well. The trials ended, in fact, in the end of the 1935 trials, the tg&e company dropped out of the race. They had been developing like a copy of the Czech ZH29, and it had significant accuracy problems that they didn't feel they could resolve. So they dropped out in 1935. There was one last trial, might have ultimately been the final trial to determine a winner in 1937, which was just between the Nippon Special Steel Pedersen copy, gas-operated Pedersen, and this, the Army Ordnance Department's blowback, or delayed blowback Pedersen. And in that testing, the results are kind of tricky because you've got this conflict of interest with the testing officers, and the conclusion they officially came to was that it was too difficult to determine which rifle was better because they were both excellent. The reality is probably that this was the inferior rifle. It sounds like, from what I've been able to find, it sounds like they never did resolve that issue with extraction problems once the gun got hot. They didn't apparently make very many changes between the 35 trials and the 37 trials. In 37, they submitted another 12 rifles and 12 carbines again. And ultimately, the end game of this testing was in July of 37, there was the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which was kind of the beginning of really large-scale hot warfare in China between Japan and China. And at that point, this whole semi-auto rifle development program was dropped. It was too expensive. These guns would have been over twice the cost of Type 38 Arisakas each. The Army didn't really have money for that as it was, and after the war in China started to heat up, now they need to, they're increasing the size of the Army, they're recruiting more troops, they have to arm them, they're losing rifles in combat, and they need they need more guns quickly. And so the idea of going to a more expensive gun becomes even less interesting to them. So the whole program gets dropped. Ultimately, some of these rifles did actually see combat in World War II. At least one of them, I believe it was a carbine variant that at some point had been fitted with a folding bayonet, was actually captured in combat on Okinawa. It appears that by the very end of the war, the Japanese were so desperate for small arms that they were actually issuing out some of the leftover experimental rifles that had been in storage, things like these. So kind of interesting development there that they kind of didn't make it through testing, but they ended up being used at the end of the war in combat anyway. Now, there are some interesting mechanical elements to this. Of course, it has, those of you who are familiar have noticed that it's got this kind of weird fat-bellied, guppy sort of looking thing, which you didn't see on Pedersen rifles, but you kind of did see on Johnson rifles. So why don't I bring the camera back here, let's take a look at this odd magazine, and I'll show you what it is, as well as the rest of the action. So what makes this magazine different, in fact, initially, when the Japanese Army started developing this rifle, they actually used an en bloc system similar to the M1 Garand. What was a little funny and different about it was they actually used a single stack 5-round en bloc clip. And on the last shot, of course, the gun would eject that empty clip and you'd load a new one. By the time they actually got to the 1935 trials, however, they had replaced that system with this one. This is a rotary, or a spool magazine, that holds 10 rounds, and it was to be fed. Let me lock this open. There we go. This magazine is fed by a pair of 5-round stripper clips right here. So put a clip in, strip it, put a second one in, strip it in. Then you've got this 10-round rotary magazine. You can see inside here that rotates. The spring is totally unwound right now. But it's got a pair of little cradles for the front and back of each cartridge. This is similar to what was used on the Johnson rifles, although that would be later on. There was a sporting rifle made by Steyr-Mannlicher that had a system like this, which is probably where the inspiration for that spool magazine came from. At any rate, I should point out the bolt hold open control. It is right here on the side. So should you want to lock the bolt open, because it does not lock open automatically when the magazine's empty, what you do is lift it all the way up, lift this, there we go, lift this up, and then let the bolt forward onto it, and it will hold there. Close. Now the Army also put scope mount rails on all of these guns. These don't fit the standard World War II Arisaka scopes. I don't know exactly what model of mount or optic they were planning to put on, but obviously they had the idea of making these a marksman's rifle, or potentially issuing every soldier with an optics-capable gun, which would be an interesting idea at that point. Now the magazine assembly comes out as a whole unit, although this one appears to be, well, this one is too stiff for me to pull it out. What you do is actually push in on this button, and then you can pull this lever out of the way here. And then this is a little sliding button that goes forward. And once you hold this forward, you should be able to pull the magazine assembly out. Like I said, it's awfully tight in there, stuck in place. And as I have said before, I don't want to be the one to break that. So I'm going to leave that in place so we can kind of see what's going on through the top. So we have another control here to take a look at, and that's this kind of paddle switch back here on the back of the receiver. That is a switch to isolate, well, to disconnect the mainspring from the toggle so that you can disassemble it. So what we do here is open the toggle all the way, we push that in, and it locks in place, and now the toggle is unsprung. So what I can do now is take this pin, push it out. It is not a captive pin. It just comes out, and then I can pull out. There we go. I can pull out the toggle assembly. With that toggle out of the way, we have a nice view to the inside of the rifle, and we can see a couple things. First off, we have this brass-looking piece with a square-ish hole in it. That is connected to the trigger. So when I pull the trigger, that piece moves forward. I'll show you in a moment what that connects to. We've got our toggle lock here. You can see that this lever comes up when I lift this up. So that's what you're engaging to hold the toggle in position open so that you can reload the magazine. In the magazine, we have this little spring-loaded flap. This is the feed lip that allows you to strip cartridges in, but then doesn't allow them to pop back up out of the magazine. So that holds the first round in position here where the bolt can strip it into the chamber. We do also have here a safety. This is just a simple 90-degree throw lever. And all that this does is push this bar into the receiver. That locks right here, and it does two things. It actually disables or locks the firing, not the firing pin, but the system of connecting levers that get to the firing pin. And it locks the toggle in the downward position, so you can't open the action. Not that you would want to prevent anyone from opening the action. What that does effectively is prevent anyone from bumping the handle and accidentally popping the action open so that gunk can get into it, or so that the cartridge becomes unchambered slightly. So it's interesting to note that the sights on this rifle are actually offset to the left. There doesn't appear to be a whole lot of reason for that as far as I can tell. They're not offset so far that the toggle doesn't block them when it comes up, which, by the way, isn't a real issue when you're shooting. I have shot a toggle-locked rifle, and that toggle is moving so fast that you don't even notice it being there. It's not at all distracting. This does have a Pedersen sort of style of sight, where to adjust the elevation, you push this button in and then rotate this knurled lever, which, as you can see, raises the whole sight assembly. And you have your ranges marked out here. So there's a guide notch here on the side of the receiver, or a cut, and then you've got all of your various levels for showing you what your range is. And this goes out to 1,100 meters. This then is your windage adjustment. You can see I'm moving the rear aperture side to side there. So pretty easy to use, pretty easily accessible there for the soldier. Of course, because the rear sight is offset to the left, the front sight also has to be offset to the left, as you can see there. The front sight itself is this triangular post, which is very typical of Japanese rifles. That's what you'll find on the other experimental guns, as well as pretty much every Arisaka ever. I mentioned that this is serial number 1 of its series. There is the number on the receiver. You'll also find that number on a bunch of other parts internally. It was on the front sight just a moment ago, and you'll also find it on the bolt itself. Now, speaking of the bolt, here is our toggle assembly. It's going to pivot up like this when fired, and back down when it loads a new cartridge. There's our bolt head. We've got a plunger ejector on the bottom, and an actually rather large extractor up top, and of course our stripper clip guide right there in front of the extractor. So this actually is connected to the plunger ejector, this little guy. The firing pin would be below it. You can actually see through the hole there to the tablecloth below. You can push this in and rotate it down, and then this plug comes out, and then this is kind of tight with some grease. That is our ejector right there. So that would come up through that hole. Kind of cool that it's this easy to change. Often the ejector is a tricky thing that is difficult to swap out. Now, the actual firing mechanism is contained right here. Our firing pin is contracted down in the bottom. So I had mentioned this brass-looking piece with a hole in it before. That, as you recall, is connected to the trigger. So this hook drops into that hole, and when you press this, the action dry fires. Now you can see the hammer block right there, or the striker, I suppose it would be technically. Normally that would have gone forward to hit the firing pin right here. Of course, the firing pin is missing on this one. And then it is cammed. So there's a spring up in here. And you can see as I am twisting this piece, that striker is getting pushed back into position. So when it fully cycles up to there, the striker's all the way back and it locks into place on the sear and it's ready to fire again. So that's what happens when the bolt cycles like this. It recocks right there and then ready to fire. So ultimately it is the geometry in these pivot points that prevents the action from opening until pressure has dropped. And it does that not by sensing what the pressure is, but rather by only by acting slowly enough that a calculated amount of time has passed before this is able to open and start to extract the cartridge. And in that time, we know that pressure has dropped to a safe level. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. These are, I think, really fantastic looking rifles. It's a shame that the Japanese never realized that there was that missing element of the hard wax lubrication on the cartridges necessary to make these really work well. Otherwise, it could have been an interesting opportunity for a Pedersen rifle to actually be adopted by a significant military force. So, if you'd like to own this one yourself, it is serial number 1 of the rifle length guns. Again, I'm not sure if it's a 35 trials gun or a 37 trials gun, but it is one of the two. If you take a look at the description text below or above, depending on how you're watching this video, you will find a link to Rock Island's catalog page on this rifle. You can check out their pictures and their description, and you can place a bid right there through their website. Thanks for watching.